Well, thank you for everyone. This is a fascinating discussion, and I think I'm going to be calling a few of you. If I don't get to ask you questions, we are going to be talking because some of these issues really need a deeper dive. Mr. Young, I'd like to start with you. In a previous life, I worked for the Algonquin Nation, and the only time we ever got to meet the forestry companies was when we ran blockades. That was the way it was in the early 2000s, and things have changed dramatically since then. But they haven't, it's still not a fair ground. We have communities where to assess long-term cutting plans, to be out there on the trap lines making sure everything's okay, then to have to deal with mining companies, and then to deal with hydro projects. It tends to be the same department on the reserve that doesn't have the kind of backup and support that a major company would have. Plus, they also then have to deal with, are they going to get beyond subcontracting and actually be able to get out there and take control and do something, and also do economic development? So I'd like to hear your thoughts, what you said about it's not the issue even so much of capacity, but the financing to be able to actually protect the forest and put an Indigenous lens on development.
Well, I guess what you would want to do, what every nation that I'm aware of wants to do, is to have a comprehensive base of Indigenous knowledge in a modern day format with proper mapping, GIS layers that's dynamic, that can model vegetative cover and different types of operations, industrial, traditional, you name it. Now that knowledge layer takes money, and this is why in my submission I asked for an across-the-board increase to ISK CERNA's economic development funding envelopes, because they have land planning capacity monies in there. Is 15% enough? Might there need to be some line item increases to the land use initiatives that they have underway? Probably. You know, I think the latest numbers I was aware of was around 9 million they had for that for the whole nation. If you did some math on the 600 nations, let's say 400 of them need work, you know, you're coming up with $30,000, $40,000 to fund very technical work. You know, the what you're asking there is quite complex. I would say you'd probably need around $150,000 over a number of years for a nation to say, hey, we're ready to talk. We can talk to an FPAC member. We can talk to a PDAC exploration miner. We can talk to our own people about what's there. And so I think that's part of the knowledge equation. I guess the next part of it is for nations that look at these other economic activities, what I think a lot of folks are realizing is that many of them now want to be involved on the industry side of the equation, but they want equity and they want a measure of control and participation, and they don't have equity to buy into an existing firm or an existing operation. And so that's where this $20 billion that is hanging there for tribal initiatives in the South, you know, what if there was $5 billion for Indigenous forestry equity, loan guarantees to buy into operations, to get the economy moving, to do it to the right way according to Indigenous nations? I think that's how I like to think about things. It's complex. I don't know if I've got to the root of your
very helpful because, yeah, to get to the table, it is very complex. It's not, you need to be able to map it, and you need the resources to do that right. In the communities that I've always worked with, the number one plan, even ahead of economic development, is protecting the land.
Yep.
That's always first and foremost. So when I talk to communities in the Cree communities, the Ojibwe communities, the Algonquin communities, I'm hearing again and again about glyphosate. It's killing amphibians. It's killing insects. The moose are not coming back. It's in the blueberries over a year after the cutovers have happened. You know, we've seen the Monsanto papers released, and there's really frightening documents. I mean, Bayer has paid out $10.9 billion over cancer claims. So from an Indigenous perspective, because we know we're hearing this again and again from Indigenous communities who are saying they're just not going to go along with this anymore, what would you say representing Indigenous forestry in terms of managing the forest with or without glyphosate?
I'd say the precautionary principle would probably be the number one principle that Indigenous nations on the land would move to. But I think some of the science that is coming out with regarding a more naturalistic and indigenous, frankly, an indigenous forest management lens on that land base when you're talking about free-to-grow prescriptions, mechanical or herbicidal. I think the long-term data now is coming out, and some of the work that's been done by Dr. Samard at UBC has spoke to this, where there's a lot of wisdom in the indigenous, but also the highest levels of science now saying, you know, a more naturalistic way to manage the land base is better. What the indigenous forest sector would say, and this is actually all over the world, I've been all over the world, Mr. Angus, on this. Indigenous peoples will say, we don't want to live in a park, but we don't want to live in a plantation. And I think the chemical treatments that you're talking about and that type of intensity, that's more towards the plantation style type of value system with your activity base there. They want to be in the middle. And what they will say is about half of the land base we will use for cultural, traditional, setting aside, giving nature some resilience, some capacity to grow, some capacity to just do its thing. But the other half we want to make a living with. But each nation, this is where the planning comes through, each nation will have specificity. They may want more protection, they may want less, but they all want to make a living, and they all want to be on that land base from time immemorial to 7 generations from now.
Great, thank you.